Harlem was once the domain of dreamers, hustlers, and cultural icons. In the midst of Prohibition-era chaos, jazz clubs, and the looming presence of mobsters, Ellsworth Raymond "Bumpy" Johnson rose to become one of New York's most formidable underworld figures. While Chicago had Al Capone and New York's Five Families often conjured images of Lucky Luciano or Meyer Lansky, Harlem produced its own notorious kingpins, and Bumpy was at the forefront. He was born on October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina, during an era of severe racial segregation. In these early years, his family faced obstacles that could crush a less determined household. His father was a fisherman, and his mother worked as a domestic helper for white families, splitting her time between Charleston and New York. They had 8 children, all constrained by the tight space of racial intolerance. Bumpy's fiery temper, intellect, and rebellious streak appeared even in his earliest moments. A small bump on the back of his head earned him his lifelong nickname. That childhood environment, from the deeply religious core of his family to the threat of violent racial attacks, shaped the boy's mentality. South Carolina, especially in the early 20th century, maintained entrenched hostility toward its black residents. One day, Bumpy's older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. Fears of mob justice soared, and the family rushed Willie to New York City, where the risk of a lethal vigilante response might be lower. Bumpy soon followed in 1919, seeking bigger horizons and a safer future, though that path led him into the dark history of Harlem's underworld secrets. Arrival in Harlem. At the age of 14, Bumpy stepped onto 7th Avenue among the hustle of Harlem. He was small for his age, but he carried himself with confidence, or sometimes outright defiance. Harlem, too, was changing. On one hand, it was a hotbed of arts and culture, the stage for the Harlem Renaissance. On the other, it was under the watchful eye of crime families looking to seize control of alcohol smuggling, gambling spots, and any illicit enterprise they could find. When young Bumpy arrived, he was an easy target for bullies, but he quickly discovered he was no pushover. One frequently repeated tale. On his first day heading to school, he encountered a group of older teens rolling dice on the sidewalk. Tension rose. A sudden scuffle erupted when one youth demanded that Bumpy empty his pockets, but Bumpy's quick fists and street smarts left his assailant bloodied. Observers recalled the abrupt transformation of this shy newcomer into a cold-eyed fighter who wouldn't hesitate to use any advantage, even a couple of coins gripped in a fist, to defend himself. Impressed by Bumpy's agility, a few onlookers befriended him, and they started roaming the neighborhood in a tight-knit group. Though Bumpy excelled academically, reportedly skipping more than one grade in Charleston, he abruptly dropped out of school. He grew enamored with the street lifestyle, hustling for coin wherever possible. Sometimes it involved small-time rackets like charging to sweep store entrances. Later, it expanded into more lucrative hustles. By 16, he was involved in protection work, collecting money from local businesses to keep trouble away. Eventually, he crossed paths with a man named Bub Hewlett, a towering figure known for his vicious temperament. This relationship would ultimately propel Bumpy into the realm of bigger organized crime. Introduction to the streets, Bub Hewlett. By the 1920s, Harlem had developed an extensive network of secret bars, speakeasies, and underground gaming halls. This environment allowed mobsters, corrupt cops, and unscrupulous politicians to profit while ordinary people tried to survive an unfriendly economy. Bub Hewlett was among the toughest local enforcers, the kind of man who enjoyed intimidation. Stories circulated about him marching down the street with brass knuckles or a bat, daring anyone, even the police, to interfere. His massive size, even approaching 2 meters in some retellings, gave him a distinct advantage. When Bub discovered that an upstart teenager was siphoning protection fees from some local establishments, he was furious. He confronted Bumpy outside a grocery store, only to discover that the youngster had an audacious tongue and a knack for bravado. Legend has it that Bumpy simply shrugged off Bub's threats, stood his ground, and declared that he and his friends had claimed that block. Bub, surprisingly, was more amused than enraged. Instead of beating Bumpy to a pulp, he saw potential in him. They struck an unlikely partnership. Bub recognized that Bumpy's smaller frame masked a cunning mind and savvy instincts. From that day forward, Bumpy's influence expanded faster than ever. The era of underground lotteries. Throughout the roaring 1920s, the numbers racket or numbers game reigned as the poor man's lottery. Residents placed small bets on three-digit combinations, hoping for a big payout the next day. While most gamblers never struck it rich, the money that poured into this illicit enterprise was enormous, especially during the hard economic times of the Great Depression. Many of Harlem's biggest numbers bankers were said to earn more in a week than the U.S. president. That massive stream of cash inevitably caught the eye of bigger and more dangerous interests. One such racket boss was Stephanie St. Clair, often called the Numbers Queen. She was known for her sharp wit, resilience, and unwavering refusal to hand over her lucrative empire. When she recognized Bumpy's potential for enforcing her interests, she brought him under her wing. He became not only her bodyguard, but also a trusted lieutenant. Whispers circulated through Harlem of how Bumpy would escort her to posh events and keep suspicious onlookers at bay with a mere glare. Yet competition loomed. Dutch Schultz, a gangster from the Bronx with ties to powerful crime families around the city, was itching to move into the Harlem lottery scene. He had lined his pockets during Prohibition through alcohol smuggling, and once liquor became legal again, he sought new income streams. The numbers game in Harlem was a gold mine, so he made it a top priority. Dutch Schultz was notoriously violent, known for punishing defiance with horrifying brutality. He used intimidation, kidnappings, and strategic alliances with certain corrupt officials to muscle in wherever he wanted. People in Harlem started receiving threatening visits from Schultz's men, warning them to either let the Bronx gangster manage their operation or face lethal consequences. The brewing conflict, St. Clair versus Dutch Schultz. When Dutch Schultz launched his assault on Harlem's gambling scene, Stephanie St. Clair, backed by Bumpy Johnson, wasn't about to fold. She had built her empire through grit, cunning, and constant vigilance against unsolved mysteries swirling around the underworld. Rather than yield, she doubled down on her operations. Drive-by shootings, threats, and beatings became tragically common. Loyal employees who refused Dutch's offers were sometimes battered or worse, but St. Clair, alive to the risk, refused to budge. Bumpy, newly out of prison, sentenced for minor burglary and assault charges, returned to find his mentor's territory under siege. Fired up, he resolved to defend Harlem from this invasive force. Bumpy's personal network grew. His closest allies, Nat, Finley, Junie, and a handful of others, joined him in guerrilla tactics. They would ambush Schultz's men when they least expected it, slip in and out of the crowd, and remain hidden among Harlem's African-American population, a stark contrast to Dutch's mostly white circle who stood out on these streets. Though severely outnumbered, Bumpy's small band was agile with home field advantage. By 1933, the conflict had escalated into a full-blown war, complete with nightly shootouts, kidnappings, and sabotage attempts. Neither side would give an inch. Allies turned enemies. Bub Hewlett's shift. It soon emerged that Bub Hewlett, the same man who had once mentored Bumpy, had switched sides. Realizing the large sums of money Schultz offered, Bub hopped onto the Bronx gangsters' payroll. That betrayal fueled Bumpy's rage. The conflict took on a personal dimension. Both men were known on these streets, respected and feared by many. Their duels became the stuff of true crime legend, with each side claiming minor victories. Neither Bub nor Bumpy could land a definitive blow, at least until Bub ended up in prison on unrelated charges in 1933. His incarceration severely undermined Schultz's local muscle, leaving the gangster to rely on other henchmen like the dangerous Ulysses Rollins. Seeking a bigger audience, meeting Lucky Luciano Dutch. Schultz wasn't Harlem's only concern. Charles Lucky Luciano was also forging a new era for infamous syndicates, uniting various mafia factions across the city. He established the Commission, a collective that divided territories among the 5 families and regulated mob activities to reduce detrimental turf wars. Luciano's name became synonymous with modern American organized crime. Bumpy, well aware that defeating Dutch alone might not end the external threats, began to suspect that bigger players would soon eye Harlem's profitable gambling market. At one point, Bumpy managed to reach out to Luciano himself. He told the Don about the Violi, a net crisis in Harlem. Luciano, known for his business logic, recognized that Harlem remained valuable. However, he politely distanced himself, implying that if he ever moved in, he'd expect broad creative control and a share for himself. If Bumpy refused, he'd risk an even bloodier conflict with a far more organized machine. Bumpy, though impressed by Luciano's reputation, remained defiant. He warned the Mafia boss that he would not relinquish Harlem's black-owned lotteries. Luciano reportedly brushed it off. He had far larger concerns than a local enforcer. And yet, he couldn't help but notice Bumpy's boldness, escalation, and the downfall of Dutch Schultz. The war dragged on from one ambush to the next. Dutch Schultz grew increasingly paranoid, lashing out at both allies and enemies. He also faced legal troubles from zealous prosecutor Thomas Dewey. Terrified of indictment, Schultz proposed murdering Dewey to remove the threat once and for all. But this plan angered the commission. Killing a famous prosecutor was far too reckless, threatening to draw unprecedented heat onto the entire underworld. The story goes that mafia bosses decided Schultz would be better off eliminated. So, in 1935, Dutch Schultz was ambushed in a New Jersey restaurant and mortally wounded. He died in the hospital shortly after. This effectively ended his ruthless expansion plan in Harlem. With Schultz gone, St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson celebrated an enormous victory. But the question remained, would the Italian Mafia now seize control of local gambling? The commission eyed Harlem's potential. Bumpy worried about losing the independence they had fought, bled, and nearly died for. Nevertheless, only a week passed before Bumpy and Luciano were face to face again, this time at the latter's invitation. The conversation was a subtle dance between two cunning men. Bumpy confessed that no one could truly outmuscle the Mafia, but he wasn't about to let them step all over Harlem's African-American operators. Luciano, with cool detachment, recognized the strategic advantage of maintaining stability. He and Bumpy shaped a handshake agreement. The older, established numbers bankers would remain free from interference, while new gambling enterprises would come under partial Mafia control. Bumpy also asked for official acknowledgement that he had a seat at the table for Harlem operations. After hours of back and forth, they parted with mutual respect, years of turbulence and friendship. From then on, Bumpy's presence in Harlem soared. Locals revered him as a champion who had stared down the might of real mafia stories and found a path to coexistence rather than total capitulation. Whether this alliance was truly equal is debatable, but it allowed Bumpy to solidify his reputation as the Godfather of Harlem. The city's underbelly recognized him as both dangerously clever and fiercely protective of his home turf. Many nights found him celebrating at clubs where staff scurried to provide free drinks in hopes of winning his favor. Some suspected he even played chess against Lucky Luciano, the two of them matching wits quietly in lavish hotel suites. Tales of these matches turned into an underworld legend, both men apparently splitting victories and entertaining the possibility that each could unpredictably outmaneuver the other. However, Bumpy's success led to more scrutiny from authorities. During the 1930s, he served additional prison stints for crimes like assault or robbery. Some sentences were brief, others a bit longer, but none derailed him entirely. He emerged each time with the same unwavering resolve, reasserting his sway over Harlem's illicit economy. Eventually, the law caught up to Lucky Luciano too. He was arrested on charges related to forced prostitution. Whether these charges were fabricated or authentic remains a subject of unsolved mysteries in the annals of true crime. Nonetheless, one rumor claims that once in prison, Luciano found himself targeted by an assailant only to be saved by Bumpy, who attacked the would-be stabber before the blade found its mark. Supposedly, this act further sealed their bond. Although no one can confirm every detail, the myth persists. Bumpy protected Lucky behind bars, and Lucky's men subsequently reciprocated that loyalty in future dealings. Return to Harlem. Sometime later, Bumpy was released back onto the streets in 1947. He was older, wiser, but still had the fire in his belly. Harlem had changed in his absence. New faces replaced old loyalists. Certain businesses had closed or merged into bigger syndicates. The Italian Mafia's hold on some neighborhoods seemed more entrenched than ever. Bumpy soon discovered that people like Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, and others were keeping an eye on Harlem. The concept of the deal that Bumpy had sealed earlier was overshadowed by new leadership who wanted total control. Early attempts to muscle Bumpy out of his position came swiftly. Some mafia upstarts insisted that if Bumpy reopened his old lottery shop, he needed official clearance, and a big chunk of his profits would go downtown. Bumpy refused. He argued that his original agreement still stood. Tensions flared. According to stories, Bumpy calmly walked into a meeting with 5 or 6 made men, listened to their demands, and then informed them that no one would direct or manage him. He left the table without a single shot fired. In the next days, a wave of whispered threats started swirling. Some believed a second Harlem War was imminent, but none erupted. An intervention from more senior mafia figures, and possibly from Lucky Luciano overseas, convinced them that harassing Bumpy was a dead end. Then came gifts. A brand new black Cadillac greeting him outside one morning, piles of cash, quiet signals of respect. Thus, Bumpy resumed his role as the man to see if he wanted to run numbers in Harlem. He took cuts from those he protected, enforced harsh discipline on anyone who got out of line, and occasionally gave back to the community in philanthropic ways. Many considered him a Robin Hood figure, a dark history twist on that legend, granting freebies to needy folks, paying rent for neighbors, or distributing groceries to the impoverished. If you asked older residents on the block, they might say, "Bumpy was tough, but he looked out for us. He kept us safe. He was one of us." Of course, others would simply call him an opportunist or a gangster who profited from the neighborhood's hardships. Friendship, betrayal, and the Flash Walker incident. By 1948, Bumpy's empire was humming along smoothly. Then a young man named Flash Walker entered his circle, introduced by a mutual acquaintance with claims that the kid was reliable, a hard worker, and in desperate need of guidance. Bumpy felt some sympathy. Flash was orphaned, short on money, and had grown up on the streets. So Bumpy took him under his wing, giving him menial tasks at first, eventually letting him assist with the numbers racket. Flash excelled at persuading customers to wager large sums, fueling Bumpy's profits. Soon, the older gangster began to treat Flash like the son he never had. But trust is fragile in the underworld. Unbeknownst to Bumpy, Flash got mixed up in a stolen check scheme. Needing a discreet way to cash them, Flash used Bumpy's personal bank account behind his back, forging signatures. When the bank alerted Bumpy to suspicious activity, he was livid. Yet that wasn't even the worst of it. Bumpy's teenage daughters complained that Flash had made inappropriate remarks and even touched them without consent. So the enraged father confronted Flash in broad daylight, beating him viciously. Onlookers said the young protégé's face became unrecognizable, while Bumpy unleashed all the fury that only a betrayed parent could muster. Embarrassed and enraged, Flash fled. He soon conspired with a shady associate to hide heroin in Bumpy's furniture and tip off federal agents. The plot triggered a catastrophic chain of events. A narcotics raid landed Bumpy behind bars, charged with drug dealing. Bumpy insisted he had never touched dope, but the feds wanted him out of Harlem's power structure. They refused to drop charges unless he would rat out other criminals, something Bumpy would never do. Ultimately, in 1953, after several years and a torturous trial, a jury found him guilty of drug-related offenses. He stood in shock as the judge declared his sentence, up to 15 years behind bars. Alcatraz and the alleged escape conspiracy. Bumpy spent much of his sentence in Alcatraz, the infamous rock off San Francisco's coast, reputedly housing the worst of the worst. Guards addressed inmates only by number. Psychological pressure was constant. Hoping to degrade them, wardens instituted strict regimens of isolation and forced labor. Yet rumors circulated that Bumpy used outside connections to secure some small comforts, extra rations, or perhaps smuggled reading materials. At Alcatraz, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers orchestrated a legendary 1962 escape that became one of America's enduring unsolved mysteries. Some whispered that Bumpy had used his underworld secrets to help them arrange a boat. Officially, no trace of the trio was found. Many suspect they drowned, but local legends claimed they reached the mainland undetected. Whether Bumpy truly masterminded any part of that operation remains speculation. Regardless, Bumpy's own fortunes shifted. In 1963, he was released on parole. His old comrade Junie picked him up in a flashy convertible, cruising the same Harlem streets that once feared them both. Word moved fast. Residents emerged on stoops, even throwing confetti in some accounts, as if greeting a hometown hero. Bumpy, his eyes misty, waved to the crowds who had not forgotten him. After a decade lost behind prison bars, he intended to rebuild his life. Yet time changes everything, and so did Bumpy's own health. The final chapter. By 1967, Bumpy suffered from serious heart troubles, a hidden weakness that no bullet could match. He tried to keep it under control, meeting friends, managing the leftover networks of gambling establishments, and fending off newcomers. Heroin had flooded Harlem by then, transforming the old numbers racket into a drug haven that devoured entire families. The tide had shifted, big time. People like Frank Lucas and others from Bumpy's circle would later be accused of flooding the streets with narcotics. There are contradictory accounts about Bumpy's personal stance on heroin. Some maintain that he had once declared he'd never let it into Harlem. Others recall that he tested the waters of that lucrative trade, but the deeper he might have gone, the more complicated it grew. Bumpy's fate arrived on July 7, 1968, when his heart abruptly stopped as he was preparing to eat at a local diner. At 62, he left behind decades of infamy, stories of unbreakable loyalty, and a complicated legacy in the annals of real mafia stories. People across Harlem mourned him sincerely. On the day of his funeral, hundreds crammed the streets around the funeral home to pay respects. Flowers and tributes covered the sidewalk. Many spoke of him as the Robin Hood of 125th Street, referencing the times he doled out free meals or paid folks rent so they could avoid eviction. Others, especially those who had been on the receiving end of his harsh methods, felt relief. Whatever one's view, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had shaped Harlem's dark history more than almost anyone else. A complex legacy. Bumpy Johnson's life epitomized every contradiction and complexity within the organized crime universe. An exceptionally bright child who might have thrived in law or medicine, he chose, or was pushed by circumstance, to harness his intellect for illicit pursuits. He saw African Americans marginalized at every step, so he staked a claim in a world that often gave them no legitimate place, rising to become one of the most notorious kingpins in New York City's rich underworld secrets. He negotiated truces with powerful mafia leaders, outmaneuvered dangerous foes, battled law enforcement, and, ironically, used some of his illicit gains to support local schools, churches, or families in financial straits. No shortage of true crime documentaries and infamous syndicates anthologies have recounted Bumpy's war with Dutch Schultz, his uneasy friendship with Lucky Luciano, or his final convictions. Contemporary retellings debate whether his influence on Harlem was largely beneficial, protecting residents from external predators, or whether Bumpy was simply another opportunist turning a profit at the community's expense. Some consider him a paternal figure who combated racism and refused to let white gangsters call all the shots. Others see him as a fundamentally violent man who, albeit with a dash of humanity, inflicted fear and chaos. And what about those who followed in Bumpy's footsteps? Figures like Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes soared to prominence in the heroin trade, each forging their own brand of kingpin status. Those subsequent chapters of Harlem's real mafia stories revolve around drugs on an unprecedented scale, where fortunes soared higher and tragedies took on new proportions. Some observers argue that if Bumpy had lived longer, he might have reined in that poisonous wave or collaborated with it, depending on the telling. Indeed, the realm of true crime in 20th century Harlem is full of these ambiguities. Enduring myth and mystery. If there's one undeniable truth, it's that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson left an imprint on Harlem and the broader tapestry of American organized crime. He survived multiple stints in prison, faced bullets, and outlasted adversaries who once looked invincible. He earned the respect of mob luminaries and a portion of everyday Harlem residents alike. Even in the court system, prosecutors labeled him one of the most dangerous criminals in Harlem's history, acknowledging his uncanny ability to sway entire neighborhoods. Indeed, Bumpy's story remains tangled in rumor, myth, and narrow glimpses of fact. He has been fictionalized in books, movies, and TV series devoted to notorious kingpins and dark history. Each retelling adds a layer, concluding with the memory of a proud African American from a modest background who climbed to the apex of the American underworld, cementing a reputation that resonates in Harlem's lore. Possibly he regretted not completing his studies. Possibly he found satisfaction in pushing back at an oppressive system. Possibly he just lived for the excitement of that gangster lifestyle. It's impossible to say for certain. Yet, for a man known as the Godfather of Harlem, the facts speak volumes. 26 total years spent behind bars, a body riddled by bullets on multiple occasions, a rap sheet bursting with charges from burglary to assault, and a name that still arouses fascination in the realm of true crime long after his death. Those who pass by certain corners in Harlem might still hear the echoes, tales about a man who, depending on who you ask, either saved or devastated the community around him. Whatever moral lessons can be gleaned from Bumpy Johnston's saga, it stands as a timeless example of how precarious the border is between survival and vice, between protector and predator. He challenged the old stereotypes of what an African-American man could achieve in an era marked by violent racism, albeit ironically through an equally violent path. His is a dark history epic of ambition, betrayal, cunning alliances, brutal retributions, and short-lived triumphs. Standing among the ranks of notorious kingpins, Bumpy's place is cemented. His alliances with crime families, showdowns with infamous syndicates, and near-mythical run-ins with figures like Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano ensure that he remains a fixture in true crime records. He was a gangster, yes, but one who has been immortalized in folk narratives as a resourceful, ironically principled figure straddling that razor-thin boundary between acceptance and infamy. In the end, the name Bumpy Johnson encapsulates Harlem's contradictions of that age: creativity, defiance, oppression, solidarity, violence, and aspiration. Ultimately, he joined the pantheon of real mafia stories that ripple through American memory, where the lines between friend and foe, hero and villain get thoroughly blurred, and where a man's legend can outlast his mortal heart, beating to a rhythm he helped define on those storied streets.